My upbringing was anything but conventional. I grew up in a Southern Baptist household, a place where the existence of ghosts was dismissed outright, yet the presence of demons was accepted as a grim certainty. The teachings were clear: if something strange occurred, it was not a lost spirit wandering the earth, it was something far darker, something deeply rooted in Scripture. While I never fully embraced these beliefs, the idea that rejecting the existence of demons meant rejecting the very essence of faith was drilled into me from a young age. My mother, however, was a different story. Faith was more of a suggestion than a requirement for her. She wasn't an atheist or agnostic, she simply floated through life indifferent to divine matters. God and I have an understanding, she would say, shrugging off my questions about church and spirituality. While I clung to religion as a source of structure and stability, she seemed to drift further away from it. This divergence created a chasm between us that only widened with time. It pains me to say it, but my mother struggled with addiction and mental health issues, elements of her life she was unwilling to confront. Some days, she was functional, appearing to hold everything together. Other days, she descended into a realm of erratic behavior that left me feeling helpless and confused. Looking back, I suspect she may have suffered from schizophrenia or a similar condition. But before you label my family as neglectful regarding her mental health, remember it was a different time, a time when such things were often ignored or misunderstood. One particularly vivid afternoon, I had a nightmare that remains etched in my memory. In this dream, I was lying in bed when my mother stormed into my room, her face twisted in rage. She grabbed my wrist and began shaking me violently. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart racing, convinced I had escaped something dreadful. But just as I began to shake off the remnants of the dream, it happened again, only this time, I was wide awake. The door burst open, and there she stood, just as she had in my nightmare, the same furious expression, the same unhinged words spilling from her lips. It felt as if the dream had materialized into reality, a prophecy come to life. I barely managed to push her away and screamed for her to stop. Just like that, it was over. She left as suddenly as she had entered. When I confronted her the next morning, she wore a mask of confusion, seemingly hurt that I was so shaken. I told myself it was merely a bizarre coincidence, a strange overlap between my subconscious anxieties and her unpredictable moods. But a nagging part of me whispered that it was something far worse. A few weeks later, I heard a scream that shattered the stillness of the afternoon. It was a strange sound, not a panicked scream, but one filled with a bizarre excitement. I rushed outside, my heart pounding, and froze at the sight before me. My mother stood in the yard, grinning widely, gripping a massive 7-foot-long snake in her bare hands. This was terrifying enough on its own, but there was a deeper layer to the horror. My mother had a lifelong phobia of snakes. She couldn't even glance at them on television without recoiling in fear. And yet, there she was, holding one as if it were a beloved pet. She beckoned me closer, urging me to grab the snake. I instinctively took a step back, shaking my head in disbelief. "Mom, what the hell?" I stammered. But the look in her eyes told me she couldn't comprehend my words. Her smile widened, her head tilting slightly, as if she were trying to scare me. Overwhelmed, I turned and ran back inside, slamming the door behind me. My heart raced as I peeked out the window, watching her stand there, still holding the snake like an offering to some unseen force. Eventually, she let it slither away into the grass and walked back inside as if nothing had happened. Later, when I confronted her about the incident, she shrugged it off, insisting I must have had a strange dream. She refused to entertain my questions, leaving me feeling unsettled and alone. That bizarre incident paled in comparison to what transpired next. That winter, my church organized an overnight lock-in, and I was relieved to attend. Church was my refuge, a place where I could escape and be around predictable, normal people. My mother dropped me off, completely sober, and even kissed my forehead as she drove away, a gesture that seemed almost foreign. Around 4:30 a.m., just as we were settling into sleep, a loud knocking echoed through the chapel. We all sat up, glancing at one another with wide eyes. The knocking moved around the building in an impossible manner, sometimes sounding as though it came from multiple directions at once. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't an animal. It was rhythmic, circling the chapel like something, or someone, was trying to break in. The pastor, the only one with a key, was asleep in his office and hadn't heard a thing. I ran to wake him, and as he stepped into the chapel, the knocking stopped abruptly. He opened the front doors and stumbled back, fear etched across his face. Standing there, barefoot and drenched in sweat despite the freezing air, was my mother. Her clothes were disheveled, her hair clung to her forehead, and her lips moved silently as if she were trying to speak without forming any words. She didn't acknowledge the pastor, her eyes were locked onto me. A slow, unsettling smile spread across her face as she advanced toward me. I wanted to run, but the pastor whispered urgently, "Stay here." Yet I felt powerless, as though I had no choice but to go with her. I climbed into the car, terrified of what might happen next, but she remained silent throughout the drive. When we arrived home, she paused in the doorway, simply staring at me. She stood there, watching as I walked to my room, and I closed the door, locking it tight. I lay awake for hours, listening to the silence, my heart not yet at ease. The next morning, she was in the kitchen, cheerfully cooking breakfast as if nothing had happened. When she saw me, she jumped back in surprise, exclaiming that she was just about to pick me up from church. My blood ran cold. She had no memory of knocking on the church doors, no recollection of driving me home. It was eerie and unsettling. I expected someone, perhaps the pastor or an elder from the church, to mention what had happened, but no one did. It was as if they didn't know how to process it or, worse, didn't want to. That's how people treated my mother back then. As the years went by, the incidents accumulated, each more bizarre than the last. I remember one summer evening when I returned home from a friend's house. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the air was thick with an unsettling stillness. I opened the front door, and the moment I stepped inside, I felt an odd chill race down my spine. The house was dark, save for a single flickering light in the living room. I called out for my mother, but there was no response. I ventured further into the house, my heart pounding in my chest. When I reached the living room, I was met with a sight that sent my blood running cold. My mother sat in her usual chair, but something was off. She was staring blankly at the wall, her expression vacant, her mouth moving as if she were talking to someone unseen. "Mom?" I whispered, stepping closer. She turned her head slowly, her eyes wide and glassy. "You're back," she said, her voice flat and devoid of emotion. "I was just talking to him." "Talking to who?" I asked, a knot forming in my stomach. She smiled, but it wasn't her usual warm smile. It was something more sinister, something that sent shivers down my spine. "The man in the shadows," she replied. "He says you need to listen." I recoiled, fear coursing through my veins. I wanted to run, to escape the house and never look back. But I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by a combination of fear and concern. "Mom, please, let's just go outside for a bit," I pleaded. But she shook her head, her smile growing wider. "No, he wants you to stay." I don't remember how I managed to escape that night, but I do recall the sensation of cold air hitting my face as I bolted outside. I ran to a neighbor's house, knocking frantically on the door until they let me in. I stayed there, trembling, until morning light broke through the darkness. In the following days, I tried to rationalize what had happened. I told myself that my mother's mental health was deteriorating, that she had been living in her own world, one where the lines between reality and imagination blurred. But deep down, a part of me wondered if there was something more insidious at play. As I grew older, I distanced myself from her. The fear transformed into a kind of self-preservation. I sought refuge in friends and school, immersing myself in studies and activities that kept me away from home. I wanted to live a normal life, free from the shadows that haunted my childhood. But those shadows never fully left me. I would often find myself waking in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, heart racing as memories of my mother's strange behavior flooded back. The fear of her unpredictability lingered, shaping my relationships and making it difficult to trust others. Eventually, I moved away for college, believing that distance would help me escape the ghosts of my past. I surrounded myself with supportive friends and mentors, people who helped me confront my fears. I found solace in therapy, where I began to unpack the trauma of my childhood. Yet, no matter how far I ran, the echoes of my upbringing followed me, like an unshakable shadow. Decades have passed since those haunting days. My mother is gone now, but the memories linger like ghosts in the corners of my mind. I often find myself wrestling with my beliefs about the supernatural. I don't know if I believe in demons or otherworldly forces anymore, but I cannot dismiss what I experienced. The logical explanations, mental illness, addiction withdrawal, or something else entirely, seem insufficient to account for the eerie timing and the way she sometimes acted like a different person entirely. Even now, I tell myself there must be a rational answer for it all. But deep down, I wonder if perhaps there are truths beyond our understanding, shadows that linger just outside the realm of the logical. The echoes of my past continue to haunt me, leaving me questioning what is real and what is merely a figment of my fractured memories. As I navigate adulthood, I find myself more aware of the complexities of mental health and addiction. I often reflect on my mother's struggles with compassion rather than fear. I understand now that her battles were not solely hers but were influenced by a society that often turned a blind eye to mental illness. I strive to break the cycle, to create a space where understanding and empathy can flourish. In sharing my story, I hope to shed light on the often hidden struggles of those grappling with mental health issues. I want others to know they are not alone, that their experiences matter, and that healing is possible. The past may have shaped me, but it does not define me. I am learning to embrace both the light and the shadows, finding strength in vulnerability and connection. The journey is ongoing, and while the echoes of my past will always remain, I am determined to carve out a future where understanding and love triumph over fear and isolation.